Hi, and welcome to another Bible study. And today we are looking at Genesis 5 through chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And we've got two different writers. Chapter 5 is being written by the priestly tradition, or P for short. And just a reminder that the priestly tradition has the characteristics of details to ceremonies. It's a particular way of thinking and acting, how one orders their life, and then sacrifices, festival days, ritual purity. That's what that writer is concerned with. It's also concerned with the survival of the people in a correct way of living. So that's the priestly tradition. And then chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, actually all of chapter 6, but the part we're looking at of 1 through 4 is written by the Yahwehist, the J tradition. And a reminder about that. Like the Yahwehist, the J tradition is all about the notion that the name Yahweh has been used from the very beginning. So that's one of the ways to tell. It gets translated as Lord. And that J's purpose was concerned with the writing that justified the political and social realities of the Israelite monarchy in the time of King David and King Solomon. And so the theme of J's work is one of repeated human trial and failure, and that the human attempt to play God and the inevitable failures that result in that, which we can kind of understand as we think about the time it's being written. The P tradition, it is being written late Babylonian exile or after exile. So looking at dates from like 540 to 450 BCE, whereas J is writing in the early monarchy period of King David or King Solomon. So that's the 10th to 9th century BCE. And when you're looking through this of chapter 5 and then into chapter 6, but chapter 5, like thinking about, all right, what are the words translated? And we've already talked about this one, Adam, which means man, human, and it's actually the word Adam is a mixture of the Hebrew words of blood and soil. Adama, soil, dam means blood. And then Enosh, which means man, human, so it's connected to Adam. And then Mahal means praise of God. Jared means to descend. And you may be going, those sound like all names. Well, if you haven't read chapter 5 yet, you're going to find it's all names. It's a genealogy. And we're going to get into the importance of that. Even if you just skip over it, it's important to know why it's there. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, we get some words. The Hebrew word for spirit in 6:3 is different from the Hebrew phrase breath of life in Genesis 2:7. So that's important that there's a distinction here, and that the word flesh in 6:3 does not appear in Genesis 2 through 3. Also, the word that gets translated, depending on what version you're reading, if you're reading a version that says giants, or you're reading a version that's Nephilim. So the word is a Hebrew word Nephilim, and it gets translated as giants. And what's interesting is that the Nephilim is considered a grouping. They're very large, and they actually survived the flood, and they're famous for their size, which we can find in Deuteronomy 2:10. And they get mentioned in Numbers 13 when Moses sends spies into the land of Canaan. And they encounter, so in that story out of Numbers, the Israelites encounter the sons of Anak, descendants of the Nephilim. So it's kind of interesting. Like these very large giants actually are written about after the flood, even though they are prior to the flood, because we are getting close to the flood story, which actually starts later in chapter 6. The word Malach is the Hebrew word for messenger, also known as angel. And then Malachim is the plural of Malach, and that's the heavenly beings, and they perform a wide variety of functions and tasks, which is also kind of important when we read the sons of God. The geography and the archaeology still of Genesis 1 through 11, there's really nothing to place it. There's nothing to be discovered necessarily. when looking through, all right, so what are some interesting things to note if we're looking through chapter 5? The genealogy of Genesis 5 is different from the genealogy of Genesis 4. And that's because the priestly tradition wrote chapter 5 and the Yahwehist, the J tradition, wrote chapter 4. And they're trying to convey different things. But there's some overlap in names. The J genealogy includes women, and the P genealogy only includes males. The genealogy of chapter 5 is very much linear. It follows only, for the most part, the firstborn son, except in the case of Adam. Seth is actually the third, but that is where the Israelites come through. And then we also get that humans are portrayed as living longer prior to the flood, which is described in chapter 6. So it's kind of interesting. We move through genealogy and then we get to this portion where we're talking about how long humans live, and that there are claims by other civilizations. This one is not the only one of people living longer, such as the Sumerian kings. There's a list, and it has a king who reigns for 28,800 years, and then it has one that reigns for 36,000 years. So it's kind of interesting because when we're reading through the Bible and going, oh, they lived hundreds of years. And did anybody else think this way? Yes, actually, there are other times. The long lifespan, especially when looking at the biblical text, it can be related to trying to describe and trying to uplift how one is being faithful. So it's about something great of the individual, how they've lived faithfully, and so they have lived long. Now, a lifespan that is shorter than the others is Enoch, as you're reading through, but Enoch does not die, but is said to be taken by God. And the only other person in the biblical narrative that does not die is Elijah. And that story, he gets taken up in a chariot, and you can find that in 2 Kings chapter 2. And so not dying was understood to be a reward for living a good life. So you didn't have to go through the process of death. So it's highlighting that there was something different and good and wonderful about Enoch. The others were faithful. They had their long lifespans, but there was something even more special about Enoch. In chapter 5, verse 32, the genealogy formula changes from linear, and then it begins to branch out. It begins to branch out with Noah and how Noah had 3 sons. And so it's kind of interesting. We've moved linear and now we're branching. And it's important to understand genealogies, that it's to help establish one's identity as being cast in God's image. And so genealogies helped establish who belonged to the priesthood, like the Levite line, and the kingship, David's line, and then the royal line. So there's a purpose for having these genealogies. But it's also helpful to remember that genealogies have been used to hurt, exclude, divide, and diminish one's worth because of where one came from or who one was related to. And there are moments in Jesus' genealogy that we can think about in where we find it in Matthew, where actually in Jesus' genealogy, women are in that genealogy, and even women, we would go, oh, like they weren't always considered of having status. And so to recognize where there is good in Jesus' genealogy, but also to understand that there are times in the genealogies where it is meant to exclude or not good enough. And with this particular one in Genesis 5, there's no pattern to the lifespan other than what I just said about the faithful of the one has lived faithfully. So there's no numerology that can be detected, no kind of like interesting pattern to it. The mysteries of Enoch, which is in 5:21 through 24, it's generated a rich tradition. It's important to know that Enoch actually gets other books written about, and they are called the pseudo it's going to take me a moment to get this. The pseudepigraphic books. And those books are starting to get written around the 3rd century BCE. So you can look up and read if you want to, 1st and 2nd Enoch. And so it's just kind of interesting the tradition that builds upon this individual who gets mentioned in Genesis as being taken by God and not dying. And then the Lamech of chapter 5, you may have gone, wait a minute, didn't we already read about that in Genesis 4? And the Lamech of chapter 5 is very different from chapter 4. Chapter 4 is violent, while the Lamech of chapter 5 is the father of Noah, who will be one who rescues creation. So kind of an interesting difference there. And then some other things that chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 is trying to convey, or just interesting to note, is that by choosing the word daughters instead of women, the author focuses on the notion of family, progeny, and generational descent, all of which were important in the primeval history, and the primeval history being Genesis 1 through Genesis 11. And this is also the first mention of daughters in the J source. So that's kind of interesting. In a society like ancient Israel, the emphasis on daughters raises the charged issue of proper marriage, kingship, sexuality, and offspring. And these first 4 verses will eventually develop for some people into the concept of Satan, complete with his own host of fallen angels. So if you've ever heard that in Christianity, that tradition of Satan being a fallen angel, it actually begins here with chapter 6. Some have interpreted Yahweh's pronouncement in Genesis 6:3, where God's sovereignty is reasserted, seems to indicate that the crossing of boundaries between the spiritual and the fleshly was the source of cosmic evil. Some people have understood that. And then also this whole thing about the sons of God. They are considered members of Yahweh's heavenly entourage, divine beings who function in biblical text as Yahweh's counsel, divine courtiers. However, only in this spot and nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible do they behave sexually, and rarely are they depicted as acting on their own volition independent of Yahweh. And so that's really important to keep in mind. These 4 verses are very odd, and that by the late 2nd temple period, the sons, children of God, came to be identified with the angels and 2 classes of divine beings that had previously been separate. So it's just kind of interesting how this kind of challenging passage, how people begin to interpret it, the traditions that grow out from it, of people going, what's really happening here? And so this is kind of where we get into, all right, so what are the things that the text is trying to convey? Well, chapter 5 is trying to articulate the passage of time from creation of Adam to Noah, to the generation of Noah. It is a chain that links creation and the flood. And then we get that it's also trying to convey that prior to the flood, lifespans are long, but after the flood, the lifespan decreases massively, right? It's like a massive drop. We got 900 years, and then once the flood, it's like 120. Like, that's it. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, it's trying to convey that they are a brief narrative about the origins of human mortality, right? So why? Why is the human lifespan only 120 years, seemingly? Why does it seem to not go beyond 120 years? And so it's trying to explain that. And it may have also been written to try to explain the origins of a super race of quasi-deities. And the J author included this tale as a prelude to the flood story to explain the increasing corruption and wickedness on the face of the earth. Like, it's trying to explain why really awful things are happening and why really awful people. And we say this differently today. We don't say that, but we will say, right, that oh, somebody has a God complex. And when someone has a God complex, generally bad things happen from that because they think that they can do no wrong and that no one can stop them and that they have no rules upon them. And so to just kind of be aware of that. And if we're thinking about this J source, these first four verses of chapter 6 as being, all right, there's a reason for mortality. And it's important for us to remember J source, right? Being written King David, King Solomon's time, and rulers, even through the Roman emperors, they think they are divine. Like they think they are gods. And so this could be to help the Israelites understand that no, they are not. That is ended. Like there are those who claim that, but that period of time has ended. And so it's not possible anymore for these quasi deities to be walking around. And thinking also about this relationship of the crucial focus on the God human relationship. And in previous J narratives, right, which we saw with Genesis 2, starting in verse 5 and going through, that it's fraught with danger that when humans try to become God, that really things can go off the rails very, very quickly. And so we can think of the limit of 120 years as a reasonable number of actual human longevity and as a multiple of 12, which is always good formula there. We can think of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's also probably significant that Moses, according to both the Deuteronomist tradition, the writer, and the priestly tradition writers, that Moses lives for 120 years. So there's a connection there. And that a maximum lifespan of 120 years is actually a shared concept in the ancient Near East. So there's kind of this sense of we think it's 120 years. Why is it 120 years and not something else? Why is it not a different number? And so the story of 6, 1 through 4 is trying to explain why it's 120 years, trying to give people an understanding of that. And so we can think of the overall purpose of this is that genealogies are about constructing a past that anchors the present, and that there is shared ancestry. Where does it diverge and where does it share? But it's meant for drawing and helping give people identity of understanding where they came from. Then it can help with understanding why we are in a particular present moment. And then thinking of the purpose of 6, 1 through 4, it's very much talking about why is the human lifespan limited, why there is a sense of a limited mortality for humans. And then it's also kind of thinking about the boundaries between the human and the divine. So the purpose of establishing those boundaries. So I hope that this has helped in thinking through Genesis 5 and the first 4 verses of Genesis 6. Next week, we are going to get into the rest of Genesis 6, which is setting us up for the flood. And this is all about, all right, so why did this happen? How did this happen? And just what can we learn from that story? If you would like to stay for a little bit longer, I will read Genesis 5 through 6, 1 through 4, and you may just want to hear it just so you can hear how these names are read, because they get a little dicey as we read through them. So beginning in Genesis 5. This is the record of Adam's descendants. On the day God created humanity, he made them to resemble God and created them male and female. He blessed them and called them humanity. On the day they were created, when Adam was 130 years old, he became the father of a son in his image, resembling him, and named him Seth. After Seth's birth, Adam lived 800 years. He had other sons and daughters. In all, Adam lived 930 years and he died. When Seth was 105 years old, he became the father of Enosh. After the birth of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Seth lived 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh was 90 years old, he became the father of Kenan. After Kenan's birth, Enosh lived 815 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Enosh lived 905 years, and he died. When Kenan was 70 years old, he became the father of Mahalalel. After the birth of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Kenan lived 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel was 65 years old, he became the father of Jared. After Jared's birth, Mahalalel lived 830 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Mahalalel lived 895 years, and he died. When Jared was 162 years old, he became the father of Enoch. After Enoch's birth, Jared lived 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Jared lived 962 years, and he died. When Enoch was 65 years old, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God. After Methuselah's birth, Enoch lived 300 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God and disappeared because God took him. When Methuselah was 187 years old, he became the father of Lamech. After Lamech's birth, Methuselah lived 782 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Methuselah lived 969 years, and he died. When Lamech was 182 years old, he became the father of a son and named him Noah, saying, "This one will give us relief from our hard work, from the pain in our hands because of the fertile land that the Lord cursed." After Noah's birth, Lamech lived 595 years, and he had other sons and daughters. In all, Lamech lived 777 years, and he died. When Noah was 500 years old, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. When the number of people started to increase throughout the fertile land, daughters were born to them. The divine beings saw how beautiful these human women were, so they married the ones they chose. The Lord said, "My breath will not remain in humans forever, because they are flesh. They will live 120 years." In those days, giants lived on the earth, and also afterward, when divine beings and human daughters had sexual relations and gave birth to children. These were the ancient heroes, famous men. May your day be blessed. Have a good one.